Welcome to U.S. Represented. This presentation is going to focus on the four sentence patterns. And initially what we'll do is take a look at the subject-verb relationship and then examine the difference between passive and active construction, and then study the four patterns: simple, compound, complex, and compound complex, and finish up with a brief review. The first thing I would suggest is that finding the subject of any given sentence is probably the most important thing a writer should be able to do in order to maintain control over his or her writing. We know the 8 major parts of speech as being noun, verb, adjective, adverb, conjunction, preposition, article, and pronoun. But a subject is always either a noun or a pronoun, or it could be both. And the easiest way to remember where the subject is in a sentence is to understand that it is always either doing or being something. So the two examples I have down here are, as in doing, Bill walks every day. In this particular case, Bill is the subject. He's doing something. In the next example, Bill is energetic. Bill is something. And oftentimes when you're talking about the subject being something, it's tied to what is called a be verb, as in the letter be, as in is, are, was, were, am, be, being, and so forth. As simple as this might sound right now, you would be amazed at how difficult it is for a number of people to find the subject in the sentence. And honestly, this is the very beginning of sentence comprehension and control. I've listed 3 examples of subjects in the form of nouns, pronouns, or both. The baboon didn't like the cage. You notice how baboon has a feeling about something, subject, verb. The function of pronouns, as in this case being the word he, is that pronouns operate as noun substitutes to reduce, more than anything else, repetitive words and phrasing. So pronouns are nice to have around. In this particular case, we just have he lives in a fantasy world. And then in terms of the possibility of a subject being a combination of a noun and a pronoun, we have Jenny and I play guitar. Jenny and I is the subject. And they're all performing actions. They're doing things. This leads us into a very important conversation, and that is, what is the difference between passive and active construction? Keep in mind that as a good writer, you want to avoid passive construction as much as possible. I mean, it's okay to use passive construction occasionally. Most experienced writers will tell you, but you want to keep passive construction to a minimum and focus on the active voice. The active voice is nothing more than making sure that the subject starts a sentence and the subject performs the action on the verb. The subject does something to the verb. On the other hand, in the passive voice, whoever or whatever is performing the action isn't placed at the start of that sentence. It looks as if what's actually performing the action is receiving the action, which is really psychotic. It's absolutely bizarre, quite frankly. And that's what we have here in the example below. In passive construction, the food was eaten by the dog, as if the food is the center of attention. And it's not. The dog is what should be performing the action. But in this construction, the dog is at the end of the sentence, which doesn't make any sense. And notice how convoluted and confusing that structure is. And this means that we go into the process of repairing slovenly or poor writing, and all you need to do is take that word dog and have it perform the action on the verb by putting it at the beginning of the sentence. The dog ate the food. What happens when you move sentences into the active voice is that you accelerate the velocity of the text. You compact it, you speed it up, and some people counterintuitively think that this actually means you're not generating enough text. The truth of the matter is, when you get into the active voice and accelerate the velocity of your text, you can add ideas and double the content, basically, of what you're writing. Now we're ready to talk a little bit about the 4-sentence patterns, the most basic of which is the simple sentence. So let's go there. A simple sentence is just a group of words with a one-to-one relationship between the subject and verb. That means there's one subject and there's one verb in a simple sentence. That's all. And the idea stands alone as a complete thought, which is important, as we're going to find out when we get to the complex sentence. In some cases, a subject and verb can exist in a clause, a group of words, but it doesn't stand on its own as a complete thought. In a simple sentence, it does. And so the most basic example you can think of is I am. That's 3 letters, 2 words, the shortest grammatically correct sentence in the English language, along with I do, I suppose. And you have a pronoun and a conjugation of the verb be, which is the most commonly used verb in the English language. Is, are, was, were, am, be. And so that works. It's a grammatically correct simple sentence. The next one is still a simple sentence, though, because even though you have additional words, am hungry today, you still only have one subject and one verb, I am. And what am hungry today becomes is called a predicate, which is just a verbal phrase. It's a verbal word grouping that holds together to give you a slightly more sophisticated or very sophisticated thought construction. I am hungry today. Simple sentences. If we look a little further down on the page, we also see that a simple sentence is also called a main clause. This is not to add redundant terminology, but to actually create more efficacy in moving language around, because you can now suddenly equate a simple sentence to a main clause and say, oh, when I take 2 main clauses and put them together, I have a compound sentence. And that, by definition, ladies and gentlemen, is a compound sentence. It's when you take 2 main clauses, aka simple sentences, and you put them together to create a bigger sentence. Now, whenever we study any one aspect of the writing process, everything holistically comes together, and we start discussing other elements of writing as well. And here we enter into the conversation on comma usage. My gut instinct is that most people I know are comma challenged, and I think that's probably because there are 17 different ways in the English language to properly use a comma. So the best thing to do with commas is to just learn them as you go. And this is one of the 17 ways to use a comma. It's with a compound sentence. And whenever you combine 2 main clauses to create a bigger sentence, what you need to do is add a comma and a coordinating conjunction. The coordinating conjunctions can be remembered simply as the acronym FANBOYS: for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. And the example down here is a grammatically correct illustration of a compound sentence. I am hungry today, comma, so I will eat. I am subject verb, I will subject verb, comma, coordinating conjunction. Here we have another correct compound sentence, but I've below included 2 run-on sentences to demonstrate what can go wrong with this situation. In the correct example, we see, I thought he would lose, comma, but he won anyway. However, the first incorrect example is what's called a comma splice. I thought he would lose, comma, he won anyway. I think this is the most common sentence level error in the English language. At least empirically, this is what I see more than anything else. People do it all the time. And this doesn't make you a good or a bad person, or any of us, if we include comma splices in our writings, but it's a dead giveaway that we don't have control over what we're doing. And it can cost you a job. It can cost you respect. It can cost you publications. It's just awful. And of course, the comma splice then, by definition, is when you put 2 main clauses together with a comma and you don't have that coordinating conjunction. And I think everybody realizes at this point how important it is to find standalone subject-verb relationships and know what these clauses look like. The second example is less common, but it still happens. It's called a fused sentence, where you just take two main clauses and you just crash them together with no internal punctuation whatsoever. I thought he would lose, he won anyway. It's a very hurried, choppy, kind of bizarre scenario. And as I mentioned just previously, a comma splice and a fused sentence are both called run-on sentences. So you can repair them by either putting a period between them and just making two simple sentences, or by adding a comma and a coordinating conjunction. One thing that's always a good idea is to experiment with a little bit of workshopping so people can visualize what's going on, and that's what we'll do now. And while we're at it, once again, we'll continue building on our base of knowledge. Now, I'll tell you, as far as formatting goes, that there are three major formats in the English language: Chicago, MLA, and APA. Chicago is the granddaddy. It's the most complex. It's the one that includes footnotes and annotations at the bottom of pages and so forth. It's very nice. More scholarly endeavors usually use Chicago. History professors oftentimes use Chicago, and so on. MLA is an acronym for Modern Language Association. It's a good format. It's probably the most user-friendly of the three. APA stands for American Psychological Association. That's used heavily in business. It's used in the hard sciences and so forth. And it varies. But the reason I bring this up is because if you're writing formally in any of these capacities, all three take Times New Roman 12 point, and they expect you to double space. And Microsoft 2010 is formatted oddly. For whatever reasons, when you get Word 2010, you're going to get Calibri 11 point up here, which nobody on the planet uses for any sensible reason. So you have to fix that, and you can go Times New Roman 12 point, and automatically you're safe there because everybody in all three major formats accepts Times New Roman 12 point. Another thing you want to make sure you do if you're using one of the three major formats is to get your spacing correct. One way to get to the paragraph dialog box is to click this little box down here, or you can just right click next to the cursor and go down to paragraph, and voila, you have the paragraph dialog box. And unfortunately, this is defaulted at the after spacing to 10 point, which leaves big gaps between paragraphs and also screws up your header. So you want to click on the drop down there so you're set at 0 for before and after spacing. And again, oftentimes you're preset at multiple. Now you can go double, and now officially you are set up for an MLA, APA, or Chicago paper properly, and everybody is happy. So let's take a look at how we can play around with the compound sentence. Okay, that's a simple sentence. He practiced guitar all night. Subject, verb, he practiced. And practiced guitar all night is called the predicate. Then maybe somebody might say, he still couldn't master the song. That's fine. Subject, verb, he still couldn't, right? So you have two main clauses, two simple sentences. But this is where we get into the idea of flow. What if you're reading this text and you think to yourself, this is too choppy. I want to change the rhythm and the structure of my writing. So I think I'm going to turn this into a compound sentence. You know, some people might do this, and that's very common as well. It's almost right, but it's not right, because you have two main clauses, yes, put together with a coordinating conjunction, absolutely, but you're missing the comma. And one of the 17 ways to properly use a comma in the English language is to put one right after the word night. And then suddenly you have a grammatically correct sentence. Most people who don't understand what we've been talking about now will do that. They'll just put them together, and that's a comma splice. There we go. Let me go all the way through the examples of compound sentences with fanboys so this becomes reflexive in your mind, because saturation learning often works. He was popular, for he won the game. She understood the question, and she responded quickly. He did not care, nor did he do anything about it. The group used a map, but they still got lost. One should understand, or he will make mistakes. He ate, yet he was still hungry. He was hungry, so he ate waffles. One of the other things to consider with these very basic monosyllabic conjunctions is that each one of them establishes relationships between the two clauses. For example, in the penultimate sentence, he ate, yet he was still hungry, you're establishing a difference, an almost adversarial relationship between the first clause and the next. The final example is cause-effect. He was hungry, so he ate waffles. This underscores the significance of how important word choice is. You always want to select your language very carefully. Literally, you could throw the meaning of an entire chapter of one of your papers off by misusing one single word. And it could be something as simple as a coordinating conjunction. So we've examined the simple and the compound sentence. Now we have to take a look at the idea of the complex sentence. And indeed, a complex sentence is two clauses like a compound sentence. But the difference here is that one of those clauses is a subordinate clause. Now remember that a clause is always a group of words that has a subject-verb relationship. If you have a group of words that does not have a subject-verb relationship, then you have what is called a phrase. That's what a phrase is by definition. A subordinate clause, therefore, is different than a main clause because it starts with what's called a subordinating conjunction. Remember earlier we were talking about the coordinating conjunctions being fanboys. Well, let's take a look at all the different subordinating conjunctions we can deal with. After, although, because, whenever, when, whereas, wherever, while, rather than, since. These are all examples of subordinating conjunctions. And what ends up happening is that when you start a sentence with a subordinating conjunction, you have an incomplete thought automatically. And that means that you have to add another clause, aka a main clause, to that subordinate conjunction in order to create a complete thought. So the example we have here is, although the global economy facilitates third world wealth, comma, some poor countries do not benefit from this expansion. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the second example of one of the 17 ways to properly use a comma. Remember, the compound sentence has two main clauses with a comma and a coordinating conjunction. Well, a complex sentence is a subordinate clause with a comma plus a main clause. That's the structure that we're dealing with. In this particular instance, on this slide, we've broken it down into the two clauses to underscore the fact that if you only include a subordinate clause by itself, it is a fragment. Remember, we've talked about the comma splice and the fused sentence as being sentence level errors. Well, here's another sentence level error. Although the field was long, if that's all you say, yeah, you have a subject-verb relationship with field was, but because you start that sentence with a subordinating conjunction, although, that is an incomplete thought, and it's called a fragment. That, by definition, is what a fragment is. And therefore, you have to add the main clause after a comma. Before we go into the compound complex sentence, I suppose we should practice. When you see a little green squiggly line like that on your page, that means that the computer is telling you you have a grammar error. Keep in mind that sometimes this is true and sometimes it's not true. It just depends on whether or not the preset programming has captured your writing correctly. Occasionally you might have a really, really long sentence that's grammatically correct, and the system is going to tell you through that little green squiggly line that you have a fragment or something like that. Not necessarily the case. But whenever you do see a green squiggly line or a red squiggly line, which means a spelling error, it at least should draw your attention to the possibility that you might need to rephrase something. That is correct, though. This green squiggly line is a fragment, right? About this sentence. It's a fragment, so the green squiggly is correct. So all you have to do for that subordinate clause, and that is a clause because everything changed is a subject-verb relationship, right? When everything changed, comma, she remained the same. And that is a complex sentence. You were probably wondering if it's okay to shift things around from going from a subordinate clause to a main clause to a main clause plus a subordinate clause, still equaling a complex sentence. The answer, if that's what you were wondering, is yes. You could say boom. You just changed the clauses around and everything is still okay. That's still a grammatically correct sentence. But keep in mind that if you start a complex sentence with a main clause followed by a subordinate clause, you don't put a comma between the two of them. I don't know why. Maybe it has something to do with suspiration. Finally, you have the compound complex sentence. And as you might infer, it's 3 clauses, and it's always, at the very least, 1 subordinate clause and 2 main clauses, right? Because the sky is blue, comma, it makes me cry, comma, and John Lennon was the bomb. You have a subordinate clause and a main clause, a comma and a coordinating conjunction there, and another main clause to complete the thought. Another thought concerning the 4 sentence patterns. You will hear the concept of flow in any art form, whether it's music. It's the same way in sports. And we apply this word to writing too. Somebody might say, oh, your text flows. And oftentimes it might, but people don't understand exactly why. And any number of reasons contributes to why a text might flow. It could be word choice, something called alliteration, where the language is rather musical and so forth. I would suggest here too, though, that one of the best ways to make your text flow is to vary sentence patterns. If you are constantly writing in simple sentences, it's very staccato, very jackhammer-like, and that's not a good thing. If you're constantly writing in compound complex sentences, you may exhaust your reader before he or she is halfway through the first page. However, if you vary the patterns between simple, compound, complex, and compound complex, and you'll pay attention to this process as you go, you can generate some really gorgeous prose and very creative prose. And it's exciting because oftentimes your reader doesn't necessarily understand exactly why your text sounds so good, but he or she intuitively knows that it is, if that makes any sense. So I would just finish up by pointing out that finding the subject and maintaining active voice leads to good writing. It really does. Please find the subject and stay in the active voice most of the time. The other thing I would close with is that writing is extremely predictable, so keep everything simple in terms of these fundamental rules and speak with sense, clarity, and meaning. It's a pleasure working with you. Keep being who you are, and we'll talk to you soon. Take care.